Please step forward to the gallows. Any last words before you meet your maker? What if you did your job so poorly that it low-key started a rebellion? In the case of a 17th century English executioner, it was taking a really long time to do his job that included greater pain than your high school breakup, all while crowds the size of those at sporting events looked on in horror. Bad ways to go. Lethal injections are seen as the most humane way to execute someone these days, despite ongoing public outcry and controversial instances of it just not working or taking much longer and being more painful than it should. And despite a global trend of ending the death penalty, 60% of countries around the world still use it, and some still execute their citizens through beheadings or firing squads. But back in the day, things were a lot messier. There were some truly horrible ways to go. In 16th century England, Henry VIII really ramped up his empire's execution industry. During his reign, which lasted from 1509 to 1547, around 72,000 people met the business end of an executioner's axe. Heads were rolling harder than this guy. But while beheadings were definitely all the rage back then, they weren't the only option on the menu. One way to go was being crushed to death. This method was often used as a form of torture to elicit confessions, but sometimes it was just a straight-up death penalty. In 1586, a woman named Margaret Clitheroe was accused of heresy for harboring fugitive Catholic priests. A few decades earlier, Henry VIII had split with the Catholic Church because he really wanted a divorce, and in the subsequent years, there were all kinds of Catholic-Protestant disputes. Anyway, Clitheroe was sentenced to death by crushing. It wasn't pretty. She had a small, sharp rock placed under her back, then had the actual door to her home placed on top of her. She was slowly crushed to death as stones were piled up on top. The whole thing took an excruciating 15 minutes. And yeah, the symbolism is hard to ignore. She was crushed by her own door, the one she opened to help these priests who were fleeing persecution. For the very broad crime of treason, there were basically two punishments. For women, it was being burned at the stake, painful and classic. For men, it was often a thing called being drawn and quartered. This one involved being dragged naked to the gallows by a horse, then being hung up until you were just alive enough to then being disemboweled and finally split apart by having your wrists and ankles tied to the 4 horses that were spurred to gallop in 4 different directions. Yikes! Enter into all this carnage our man of the hour, England's most notorious executioner, Jack Ketch, whose botched executions eventually had him being equated with the devil himself. Not much is known about his early life. Like many executioners of his day, he served a stint in prison and then apprenticed under a man named Edward Dunn. By 1663, he had taken over as the lead executioner. Most of his work was done at Tyburn Prison in London, but some of it may also have occurred at nearby Tower Hill, where thousands upon thousands of public executions took place between the 14th and the 18th centuries. Ketch first showed up in court records in 1676, when a man was sentenced to death for murder. The mention is actually quite poetic. About the man given the death penalty, a judge wrote that the jury brought him in guilty and Jack Ketch will make him free. The next reference to Ketch came 2 years later, when a man named Edward Coleman was found guilty of treason for being involved in a popish plot. Again, more Catholic-Protestant beef. A woodcut depicting the execution has Coleman saying, "I am sick of this treacherous disease," while Ketch, holding a rope and an axe, responds, "Here's your cure, sir." A few years later, it seems Ketch's trademark brutality really started to pick up steam. In 1681, a document described how he hung a guy named Stephen College for more than 30 minutes before cutting off his limbs and throwing his entrails in a fire. Fame is often earned through spectacle, and 2 very high-profile executions ended up being Ketch's claim to it. But it's kind of uncertain whether Ketch was simply incompetent or if there was something else going on behind the scenes that he was actually really good at his job. You can think of Ketch kind of like the 1990s Buffalo Bills. It's regrettable that they lost 4 Super Bowls in a row, but hey, they did make it to 4 Super Bowls in a row. The first of Jack Ketch's high-profile botched executions was that of Lord William Russell. Lord Russell was tried and convicted of treason after opposing the ascension of King Charles II's brother, James, to the throne. James was Catholic. Russell didn't like it. Yet more Catholic Protestant animosity. It took Ketch a brutal 4 swings to remove Russell's head at the chopping block. It was such an unsightly scene that Ketch had to write a formal apology for his incompetence, where he claimed that the booing crowd had thrown him off his game. Ketch's next botched execution came in 1685. His victim this time was the Duke of Monmouth, James Scott. Scott was the illegitimate son of King Charles II, and he tried and failed to usurp the throne of his uncle King James II. When he found himself at the gallows, he reportedly touched the blade of Ketch's axe and commented that it was too dull to do a proper one-off lopping. He was right. It took several grisly hacks, and even after that, Ketch had to finish the job with a knife. The crowd was so shaken by the scene that a riot broke out, and Ketch had to be escorted away by armed guards, or else he might have faced the same fate as the Duke of Monmouth. Ketch did such a bad job that he was eventually promoted to prison warden and awarded a nice, shiny plaque with the words "Executioner of the Year" etched into it. He was actually arrested a year later and sent to prison, but we'll get into that in a second. But was Ketch just a bad executioner? Maybe not. Bribery was totally a thing back then, and prisoners with money would pay their executioners for a swift death. Lord Russell and the Duke of Monmouth had reportedly done just that, but their enemies may have slipped Ketch even more dough to make sure they had a slow and painful transition into the afterlife. Ketch was able to make a good bit of extra income through bribes like these. He and a lot of executioners also had a pretty good side hustle selling execution memorabilia. There was a huge market for this kind of stuff. Rope from nooses was thought to cure all kinds of ailments, and gamblers thought it brought good luck at the poker tables. Just a year after the grisly execution of the unfortunate Duke of Monmouth, Ketch's run as executioner at Tyburn Prison ended. He was imprisoned after an altercation with a sheriff and died a few months later. His name would live on though. He built such a reputation as a brutal executioner that people would refer to nooses as Jack Ketch's necklaces. There was even a room in a prison named Jack Ketch's Kitchen where the limbs of those who had been quartered were boiled. Yeah, they did that too. Do you think Ketch was just incompetent or paid off? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more weirdly interesting content.